$3. That's all Caleb Holt had left in his pocket when he heard the auctioneer's voice slice through the morning air like a dull knife. But what he was about to buy with those 3 crumpled bills would upend everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The dusty main street of Redstone, Arizona, was alive with the usual Saturday bustle. Ranchers, miners, and drifters crowded around makeshift stalls selling everything from cattle to pickaxes. Caleb had ridden into town for supplies. Nothing fancy, just some rope, maybe a sack of coffee if he had enough left over. His calloused hands gripped the reins of his horse as he scanned the chaos of the weekly market. That's when he noticed the crowd gathering near the old livery stable. Men were pushing forward, their voices loud, eager. Caleb had seen plenty of auctions in his time, but something about this one felt off. The voices carried a sharp edge, a hunger that twisted his gut. He tied his horse to a post and walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry desert dirt. Through the gaps between shoulders and hats, he caught sight of what they were bidding on. A young Apache girl, barely more than a child, stood on a wooden crate like a steer at market. Her dark hair fell in tangled strands around her face, and her clothes were little more than rags. But it was her eyes that stopped Caleb cold, dark and wide with a terror so raw it seemed to echo in his own chest. The auctioneer, a wiry man in a sweat-stained shirt, was barking out numbers. $2. $2.50. The men weren't looking at her face. They were eyeing her like she was a tool, something to be used up and tossed aside. Caleb felt his jaw tighten as he recognized some of the faces in the crowd, ranchers who worked their hands to the bone, mine bosses known for their brutality. A man in a dusty gray coat raised his hand. $3. The auctioneer's gavel was already rising when Caleb's voice cut through the noise, unbidden. $3.50. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Every head in the crowd turned to stare. The girl's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the world went quiet. The auctioneer looked baffled. This wasn't how things usually went. Caleb wasn't known for bidding on anything, let alone something like this. But greed won out over confusion. Going once, going twice. The gavel slammed down with a crack that split the morning in two. Then it hit him. Caleb's heart sank as he realized his mistake. He only had $3 in his pocket, not $3.50. Every eye in the crowd was on him now, waiting to see what the quiet rancher would do with his purchase. The girl was still staring, a new kind of fear creeping into her eyes, fear of him. The crowd was getting restless, their eyes boring into Caleb as he stood frozen, the weight of his impulsive bid pressing down on him. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his hand outstretched for payment. $3.50 Holt. Let's have it. Caleb's mind raced, his fingers fumbling in his pocket, closing around the 3 crumpled bills. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool Arizona morning. A low chuckle came from somewhere in the crowd. Word was spreading that the solitary rancher had overplayed his hand. Then a firm hand clapped onto his shoulder. Sheriff Amos Reed stood beside him, a man Caleb had known since their days breaking horses together. Amos's weathered face gave nothing away as he leaned in close. "You short, Caleb?" he whispered. Before Caleb could answer, Amos pressed 2 quarters into his palm. "Pay the man." Caleb handed over the money, his hands steadier than his nerve. The auctioneer snatched the bills and coins, counted them twice, then jerked his head toward the girl. "She's yours. Got papers if you want 'em." He held out a rough bill of sale, ink still wet, like she was a mule or a plow. Caleb stared at the document, then at the girl. She was trembling, her small hands clasped tight, trying to make herself invisible. The crowd was already drifting to the next auction, cattle this time, something ordinary. Caleb folded the paper and shoved it into his jacket pocket without a glance. He approached the girl slowly, like he would a skittish colt. Up close, he saw the bruises on her arms, the way she flinched as his shadow crossed her. Someone had heard her, more than one someone, by the look of it. He stopped a few feet away and held out his hand, not demanding, just offering. "My name's Caleb," he said softly. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She stared at his hand like it might bite. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, her English halting but clear. Tialichai. My name. Caleb nodded, lowering his hand. Tialichai. That's a good name. He glanced at the thinning crowd, then back at her. You hungry? The question caught her off guard. She nodded once, quick, like she feared he'd retract the offer. Caleb gestured toward his horse. There's a place across the street. We'll get you some food. But as they walked toward the diner, Caleb felt the stairs trailing them. Whispers slithered through the air. An Apache girl walking beside a white rancher meant only one thing to most folks in Redstone. When they reached the diner's door, the owner, a barrel-chested man named Harlan, stepped out to block their path. We don't serve her kind in here, Harlan said, arms crossed. Find somewhere else. His eyes flicked to Tialichai with open disgust. Maybe the alley behind the trading post. That's where they belong. Caleb felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd been naive to think this would be easy. In a town like Redstone, nothing was simple when it came to an Apache girl and a white man. The diner owner's words hung heavy in the air, sharp as the desert wind. Caleb stared at Harlan for a long moment, feeling the old familiar anger that had landed him in trouble before. He could walk away, take Tialichai somewhere else, keep the peace like he usually did. But something in him wouldn't budge. Not this time, not with her shrinking behind him, her eyes heavy with resignation. Her money's as good as anyone's, Caleb said, his voice low and even. And since I'm paying, I reckon that makes it my money. Harlan didn't move. Don't matter whose money it is. I don't serve Apaches in my place. Bad for business. He glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers. You understand, Holt. Nothing personal. But it felt personal, standing there with Tialichai behind him, her presence shrinking further, like she expected the world to keep treating her as less than human. Guess we'll eat somewhere else, Caleb said, turning to leave. But Harlan's next words stopped him cold. Better watch yourself, Holt. People are already talking about what you bought at that auction. Questions about what you plan to do with her. Harlan's smile was mean. Wouldn't want folks getting the wrong idea about your intentions. The threat was clear. In a town like Redstone, reputation was everything, and whispers could ruin a man, especially when it came to an Apache girl. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. Sheriff Amos Reed appeared beside them, materializing like a shadow. Problem here, gentlemen? His hand rested lightly on his gun belt, but his eyes were sharp as flint. Because if there is, maybe we should discuss it at my office. Harlan's bluster faded slightly. No problem, Sheriff. Just explaining house rules to Holt here. Amos nodded slowly. House rules. I see. He glanced at Caleb, then at Tialichai, who watched the exchange with wide, wary eyes. Well, as it happens, I know a place that serves decent food to anyone with coin. Widow Thompson's boarding house. She's got a dining room open to the public. It wasn't a suggestion, and Amos's tone made that clear. Caleb nodded, gesturing for Tialichai to follow. As they walked away, he heard Harlan mutter under his breath, but the man was smart enough to keep it quiet with the sheriff nearby. The boarding house was 2 blocks away, but it felt like a mile under the weight of every stair they passed. Some were curious, others hostile. Word of the auction had spread like wildfire. When they reached Widow Thompson's, the old woman took one look at Tialichai and her face softened. Poor child looks half-starved, she said to Caleb. I'll fix her something proper. But as they sat at a corner table, Caleb noticed the other patrons whispering and pointing. Through the window, he saw men gathering in small groups on the street, their postures tense. Trouble was brewing, and it was coming fast. Widow Thompson set a plate of beans and cornbread in front of Tialichai, who stared at it like it might vanish. Her hands trembled as she picked up the spoon, and Caleb realized she was fighting tears. When was the last time she'd had a real meal? She ate slowly at first, then faster, like someone might snatch it away. The dining room grew quieter, patrons leaving quickly, shooting glances their way. Widow Thompson bustled about, but even she seemed uneasy. Through the window, Caleb saw the crowd outside swell, men pointing at the boarding house. Tialiche's voice broke the silence, so soft he nearly missed it. "Why you help me?" It was a fair question, one Caleb had been wrestling with since he opened his mouth at the auction. Why had he done it? He'd come to town for rope and coffee, not to upend his life. "Don't know," he said honestly. "Just seemed like the right thing to do." She studied him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Other men, they want different things. Bad things." Caleb felt that cold anger settle in his chest again. Of course they did. To most of those men, she wasn't a person with a name and fears, she was just something to use. "I'm not like other men," he said. Before Tialichai could respond, the boarding house door burst open. 3 men strode in, and Caleb knew them instantly. Wade Carver, who owned the biggest spread in the county. His son Ethan, cruel as a rattlesnake, and Roy Kessler, who ran the silver mine outside town. They weren't here for a meal. Wade's eyes locked on Caleb and Tialichai, his face red with fury. "Holt, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Wade Carver's voice cut through the boarding house like a whip. "Holt, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Caleb set his coffee cup down carefully, meeting Wade's glare. "Eating dinner. You got a problem with that?" "My problem," Wade said, his voice rising, "is that you just made every decent family in this town look like fools, bidding on an Apache like she's worth something." The words landed like a blow. Widow Thompson gasped from behind the counter. Tialiche's face paled, but she held Wade's gaze. Caleb stood slowly, his chair scraping the wooden floor. "Watch your mouth, Carver." Ethan stepped forward, hand on his gun, his sneer sharp. "Or what, old man? You gonna fight all of us over some Indian girl?" If Caleb backed down, he might keep Tialichai safe from immediate trouble. But standing his ground could make things worse, much worse. He weighed the odds, feeling the room's tension coil tighter. "I reckon," Caleb said quietly, "a man's worth ain't determined by the color of his skin. Same goes for a woman." Roy Kessler laughed, but it was cold, humorless. "You gone soft in the head, Holt? Or maybe you've been alone on that ranch too long." His eyes flicked to Tialichai with disgust. "Either way, this ends now." The air felt thick enough to choke on. Ethan's hand hovered over his gun, his eyes gleaming with eagerness. Caleb was alone, outnumbered, and he knew Ethan had been itching for a fight like this. Before anyone could move, Sheriff Amos Reed stepped through the doorway, his boots ringing on the wooden floor. "Gentlemen," he said, voice calm but edged with steel, "I hope we're not about to have trouble in Widow Thompson's establishment." Wade turned, his face still flushed. "Reed, you need to put a stop to this. Holt's brought shame on this whole town with his purchase." Amos's eyes flicked to Tialichai, who sat still, hands folded in her lap, then back to Wade. "Last I checked, what a man does with his own money is his business. Assuming it's legal, of course." "Legal?" Ethan spat. "What's legal about buying an Apache girl like she's cattle?" "Well now," Amos said, his voice slow and deliberate, "that's an interesting question. See, I've been thinking about that auction, and I can't help but wonder where those folks selling her got the legal right to do so." The room went quiet. Caleb watched as Amos's words sank in. If the auctioneers had no legal claim to Tialichai, the whole auction was a crime, and every bidder was complicit. Roy Kessler cleared his throat, nervous. "Now, hold on, Sheriff. We were just trying to, that is, we thought, you thought you could buy a human being like she was livestock," Amos cut in. "And now you're upset because Caleb outbid you." He stepped closer to the 3 men. "Makes a man wonder what your intentions were." Wade's face was turning purple. "You can't seriously be taking his side in this." "I'm not taking anyone's side," Amos said. "I'm just pointing out that if a crime was committed today, it wasn't by Caleb Holt." His hand rested on his gun belt. Now, I suggest you gentlemen move along before I start asking more questions about that auction. Ethan looked ready to argue, but Wade grabbed his arm. Come on, he muttered. This isn't over, Holt. After they left, the dining room seemed to exhale. Widow Thompson let out a shaky sigh and started clearing tables with jittery hands. Amos pulled up a chair across from Caleb and Tialicha. They're not wrong about one thing, he said quietly. This isn't over. Word's spreading fast, and not everyone's gonna see things my way. He looked at Tialicha with kind eyes. You got somewhere safe to take her? Caleb nodded. My ranch. 10 miles out. Good. Get her there before dark. Amos leaned forward. But, Caleb, you need to understand something. What you did today, it's gonna make enemies. People who'll hurt you both just to prove a point. Through the window, Caleb saw more men gathering in the street, their voices growing louder, some pointing at the boarding house. The mob was growing, and their intentions were clear. The crowd outside Widow Thompson's boarding house was turning uglier by the minute. Caleb could hear their voices through the window, sharp with anger, words about teaching lessons and running the Apache girl out of town. Someone mentioned a rail, and Caleb's blood ran cold. Sheriff Amos Reed stood and peered out the window, his face grim. There's about 20 men out there now, he said. Some I know, some I don't. He turned to Caleb. You got another way out of here? Widow Thompson looked up from wiping tables, her hands nervous. There's a back door through the kitchen. Leads to the alley behind the general store. Caleb helped Tialicha to her feet. She'd barely touched her food since the confrontation started, and the fear was back in her eyes, raw and deep. We need to get to my horse, Caleb said to Amos. Your horse is tied up right in front of that crowd, Amos pointed out. Soon as you step outside, they'll see you. Widow Thompson spoke up, wringing her apron. My husband's got an old wagon out back. Horse too. Not much to look at, but it'll get you where you're going. Her voice softened as she looked at Tialicha. I can't stand seeing that poor child frightened like this. Caleb felt a surge of gratitude. I'll make sure it gets back to you. Don't worry about that now, she said, already moving toward the kitchen. Just get her somewhere safe. They hurried through the kitchen and out the back door. The alley was empty, but the crowd's voices echoed between the buildings. Widow Thompson led them to a small stable where an old mare stood hitched to a weathered wagon. As Caleb helped Tialicha into the wagon bed, she grabbed his arm. What if they follow? She whispered. What if they come to your home? It was a question Caleb had been avoiding. His ranch was isolated, which could be a blessing or a curse. If trouble came, there'd be no one to help. Just him and whatever fight he could muster. We'll face that when it comes, he said, trying to sound surer than he felt. Amos appeared at the alley's mouth, his face tense. They're starting to spread out, looking for other ways into the boarding house. You need to go now. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat and took the reins. The old mare wasn't much, but her eyes were bright, her stance steady. She'd do. As they pulled out of the alley onto a side street, Caleb saw the main crowd still gathered in front of the boarding house, but smaller groups were breaking off. He spotted Ethan Carver leading one, heading toward the back streets. They'd made it 3 blocks when Caleb heard the sound he'd been dreading, hoofbeats coming fast. He glanced back and saw 5 riders emerging from between the buildings. Ethan was in the lead, his face twisted with rage. There they are. Ethan's voice carried across the dusty street. Don't let 'em get away. Caleb snapped the reins, urging the mare to pick up speed, but the wagon was heavy and the horse was old. The riders were gaining fast. Tialicha pressed herself against the wagon bed, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides. The edge of town was half a mile off, they'd never make it at this pace. Then came a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past Caleb's ear, splintering the wooden seat beside him. These men weren't here to talk, they wanted blood. A second shot grazed the mare's flank, making her stumble, but the tough old horse kept running. Behind them, Ethan and his men whooped like they were hunting game, their horses closing the gap with every stride. Caleb pulled his revolver from its holster and twisted in the seat. He fired once, not to kill but to slow them down. The shot went wide, but it forced the riders to spread out, buying a few seconds. "Hold on!" he shouted to Tielichai, then yanked the reins hard to the left. The wagon lurched off the main road onto a narrow trail leading toward the rocky hills outside Redstone. The ground was rougher, harder on the wagon, but it might give them an edge. The old mare was breathing hard, foam flecking her mouth, but she pressed on, bred for endurance. The wagon rattled over rocks and ruts, and Caleb heard Tielichai cry out as she was thrown against the side. Behind them, the riders struggled with the terrain. Their horses, built for speed on flat ground, faltered on the loose soil and stones. Ethan's mount stumbled, nearly throwing him, and another rider had to pull up when his horse stepped wrong. But they were still coming. Caleb spotted a rocky outcropping ahead where the trail narrowed between two massive boulders. If he could get the wagon through, the riders would have to come single file. It was their best shot. The wagon scraped through the narrow gap between the boulders with barely an inch to spare. As soon as they were through, Caleb pulled the old mare to a stop and leapt down, rifle in hand. "Stay down," he called to Tielichai, who was huddled in the wagon bed, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan Carver appeared at the mouth of the narrow passage, his face flushed with rage and exertion. "You can't run forever, Holt," he shouted. "Send out the girl, and we might let you ride away." "Go to hell," Caleb called back, raising his rifle. Ethan's response was a gunshot. The bullet struck the rock near Caleb's head, sending shards of stone flying. Caleb fired back, his aim true this time. Ethan's horse reared, throwing the young man to the ground. The other riders pulled back, suddenly realizing this wasn't going to be as easy as they'd thought. But Caleb knew they wouldn't give up. They'd find another way around or wait for reinforcements. Then he heard something that made his stomach drop, more hoofbeats coming from ahead. Ethan's men weren't the only ones who'd left town. Someone else had taken a different route, cutting off their escape. They were trapped between two groups of riders, the rocky outcropping that had shielded them now a potential cage. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Caleb realized this might be where their story ended. He glanced at Tielichai, still crouched in the wagon, and made a choice that would change everything. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out the folded bill of sale from the auctioneer. With hands that weren't quite steady, he tore it into pieces and let the desert wind scatter them across the rocky ground. "What you do?" Tielichai whispered, watching the fragments blow away. "Setting you free," Caleb said simply. "Really free. No papers, no ownership. You're your own person now." But freedom wouldn't mean much if they didn't survive the next few minutes. The riders from ahead were closing in, and Ethan was back on his feet, rallying his men for another push. Then a voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "That's far enough, boys." Caleb looked up to see Sheriff Amos Reed and 3 deputies riding hard from the direction of town. Amos had his gun drawn, his face set in hard lines. The riders approaching from ahead found themselves caught between the sheriff's guns and the rocky outcropping. "Sheriff," Ethan called, trying to sound reasonable. "We're just trying to stop a crime here. Holt stole that girl, fair and square." "Funny thing about that auction," Amos called back, his voice carrying over the rocks. "Turns out those folks selling her didn't have any legal right to do so. Which means every man who bid on her was part of human trafficking." He spurred his horse closer. "That's a federal crime, Ethan. Means federal prison." The blood drained from Ethan's face. His companions glanced at each other, their bravado crumbling. What had felt like righteous anger minutes ago now looked like a dangerous mistake. "Now," Amos continued, "I suggest you boys ride back to town and forget this ever happened before I start asking who knew what and when." One by one, Ethan's men began backing away. They'd signed up to intimidate an Apache girl and a lone rancher, not to face federal charges. Within moments, only Ethan remained, his face twisted with frustrated rage. "This isn't over, Holt," he spat. "Yes, it is," Amos said firmly. "It's over because I'm making it over. Anyone who bothers these folks from now on answers to me personally." Ethan glared at them for a long moment, then wheeled his horse around and rode off, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the desert. Amos dismounted and walked over as Caleb helped Tialichai down from the wagon. "You two all right?" he asked. Caleb nodded, though his hands still shook slightly. "Thanks, Sheriff. Don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." "Well," Amos said with a faint smile, "Widow Thompson sent word about which way you'd gone. Figured you might need a hand." He looked at Tialichai with kind eyes. "Miss, you're safe now. And you're free. No one owns you, and no one has the right to hurt you." Tialichai looked from Caleb to Amos and back again. For the first time since the auction, she smiled, a small, tentative smile, but real. "What happens now?" she asked. Caleb gazed out across the vast Arizona landscape toward his ranch. It was a big place, too big for one man. Plenty of room for someone who needed a fresh start, a safe place to figure out what came next. "Now," he said, "we go home." 6 months later, Tialichai was running the most successful vegetable garden in the county, selling her produce to the same stores that once refused her. Caleb had deeded half his ranch to her, making her the first Apache woman to own land in the territory. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch watching the desert sunset, they'd sometimes talk about that day in Red's One when $3 changed 2 lives forever. The bill of sale was gone, scattered to the wind, but the friendship born from that moment of courage lasted the rest of their lives.